The fuck is this? A really dumb thing I like is console launch titles. They should be really easy. You want to show audiences this one title they can only play on your console that should impress them enough to buy them. The launch titles that seem to end up doing well are the ones that are different and grab you. Mario 64 was a huge leap into 3D that you could only get on the Nintendo 64. And Halo took console FPS from tiny cramped corridors that usually replicated the controls of DOS games to huge battlefields with smooth, forgiving controls, but it was only available on Xbox. Then you get the other launch titles, £425 and you can play Halo again with really weirdly low health, and £350 and you can play Crash Bandicoot again, but they focused on combat. Most launch lineups consist of weird, heavily flawed tech demos that will only become interesting in a few years when they age terribly, or the other ones that don't have as much of a spotlight and are usually much more interesting straight from release. And so Condemned Criminal Origins, a weird FPS brawler horror game which has ended up as the most memorable Xbox 360 launch title. Also, I was going to talk about it for Halloween. Merry Christmas? It's developed by Monolith Productions, who are probably best known for Fear and the Middle-earth games. They've developed a ton of other stuff though, like No One Lives Forever, Tron 2.0, Blood, and Shogo Mobile Armor Division, the best game ever made. For other horror stuff they've done, it's iffy. Fear is kind of a horror game, but it came out the same year as Condemned, so I don't know how much influence Condemned took from Fear. And even then, Fear isn't even a very good horror game, it's a better shooter. Blood you could say is horror, but that's more horror themed. It's never really actually scary. But despite all that, I get more of a horror vibe from Condemned. Some of the earlier stuff about Fear was about making the player feel like an action hero, while Condemned was more focused on horror earlier in development. It was actually originally called The Dark and had you using these supernatural powers that give me vibes of like Second Sight or The Darkness. It was changed drastically from this, but that horror aspect was always right at the front. Anyway, let's just grab a copy off the internet, I guess. In Condemned you play as Ethan Thomas, an investigator looking for a serial killer called the Matchmaker, and as the game begins you're visiting a recent crime scene believed to be caused by them. The investigators smell cigarette smoke they believe is attached to the Matchmaker and go looking for them. However, after splitting up, Ethan has an encounter with the serial killer who manages to get Ethan's gun, which he uses to kill the other investigator and the police officer Ethan was with. Since his gun was used, the police believe Ethan is the murderer, and so the game properly begins with him on the run. The story's fine, I think it's paced quite well, it's got a good combination of quick twists and slow burning changes. It starts with Ethan being fine and everything he sees being real, but the game gradually builds to a point where it's not clear what's real and what's fake. It's not amazing though, it doesn't exist to tell a story. It just kind of exists to be a hook to make you keep playing, you know, and it succeeds at that. It gives everything you're doing context and gives you a reason to keep playing, and I like how it combines the kind of horror and detective aspects, but that's about it. It's kind of weird too, you spend the game beating up homeless people as a police officer, like it feels like that should be connected, but like no one ever brings it up. They're just always like, oh, we've got to find the real killer, so I think it's just random, I'm not sure. Overall, the story's okay. It's a perfectly good hook, but it's not even like painted in a candy cane pattern. Christmas! This isn't really a game you'd play for the story anyway. One of the more notable parts of it is the gameplay. The game plays as a first-person brawler with you using what you can find in the environment to fight enemies, and what you usually find is things like planks or pipes or whatever. The combat's kinda simple. You have a block, an attack, and that's it. There's not a lot of movement options either, you can't even jump. You can at least sprint, but this would be your regular movement speed in any other game. Your regular movement speed here though is just kind of a walk. It sounds kind of shit, right? Like limited controls, slow movements. It's like the opposite of a lot of good combat systems. And it can be jarring, jumping from a medieval to Condemned is an experience, but it actually works really well. Everything feels really grounded and tense. It's really immersive in a way I haven't seen much. Immersion usually means something like, wow, it looks so good, I don't even know what's real life anymore. But this is much more like you engage fights the way you would in real life rather than the more gamey way like circle strafing. The block you have is really useful and a lot of the combat relies on it, but the space for blocking is really thin, so you can't just run into a fight, punch everyone and counter whenever an icon appears. You have to take fights really carefully, thinking about positioning, when to run up to attack and preparing to block. The weapons reflect this too. They have a kind of risk-reward thing to them. They have 4 stats: damage, block, speed and reach, but the weapons with higher damage are usually weapons with really low everything else. So a crowbar will kill enemies incredibly quickly, but blocking attacks is way slower, so getting the right timing is really difficult, and earlier on you find yourself not even blocking as much, and more distancing yourself from attacks and then swinging in with the weapon's long reach. The game doesn't have any upgrade trees or anything, but you get better at the game as you play, even in its short duration. Early on I didn't use heavy weapons where I didn't have to, because they were too difficult, but as the game continued, I got the hang of them and was much happier using them. In fact, once I got them down, I stopped using the quicker weapons because they feel really weak in comparison. There's a lot of games with slower, more damaging weapons, but those usually just play as either attacking quick while doing low damage or attacking slow while doing high damage. Condemned makes that into something that affects everything in your movement, and I think it's really effective. Along with those weapons, there's also guns, but these are less of an alternative to melee and more of a temporary power-up. There's not even a reload button. You find these weapons rarely, and if you do, they only have 1 magazine at most, so you won't be keeping them for long when you find them. But when you do, yeah, it's fun. Obviously you don't have to get close to enemies and block their attacks and stuff, you just... It's a complete change of pace. The guns do tons of damage, your slow movement makes you look like a Terminator, and then it's gone. It's a really quick gameplay change that fits completely naturally. I like it, it's good. In terms of enemy types, there aren't many. A couple have different health to others, but they all fight with the same movements. This doesn't mean enemies fight the same though. They use the same weapons you do, meaning the differences that apply to you when you change weapon apply to the enemy. You have to take into consideration the speed of the weapon the enemy is using to know when to block or how they might block, and it keeps things feeling varied despite the samey enemies. And those enemies have some really fun behaviours. If you damage them, they can limp away. They'll do this aimless spin attack to make you back off. They can take weapons from the environment. There's a bunch of stuff, and it adds to the immersion of the combat. So overall, I do really like the combat, but it's not perfect. It's got a few issues. Really quickly, there's a couple features that don't feel like they fit much. One of them is that if you knock down an enemy but don't kill them, you can do a finishing move, kind of like the finishers in Doom 4 or Resident Evil 4. But those games tie it into combat. Doom gives you health for completing finishers, so you're actively trying to hop from enemy to enemy using finishers to keep your health. And in Resident Evil 4, killing enemies straight through shooting them isn't very effective, so these finishers make it easier while asking for better accuracy. In Condemned, they're just kinda here. They seem like brutality for the sake of brutality, and some people like that, but I feel like this should be connected to the actual combat in some way, because it's actually faster to just hit them normally to kill them. It's not even like the fatalities from Mortal Kombat or anything where they're these big, like, explosive deaths. They're just kinda weak. There's also the taser, which stuns an enemy for 1 hit by default, or knocks them out later in the game. It's fine, it's helpful, but it recharges too quickly to be an actual strategic decision, and so you just use it whenever. And there's the kick, which I only used if I had a gun and didn't want to waste ammo, and even then you can melee with the gun for this exact reason, it's just the kick was a bit more convenient. These are just little extra features I didn't feel were necessary though. The actual problems were more unintentional. First of all, hitboxes are kind of messy. This isn't a DSP thing where like every time I die I loudly sigh and look at chat. This is genuinely hits that don't connect on screen will connect through like damage. This goes both ways. Sometimes I get hit by something I was explicitly out the way of, and sometimes enemies would be stunned from my block, but I was a few feet away, so they just kind of knocked their elbow out of place. The enemies also have their own problems. For one, they're not smart at all. In fact, my problems with the enemies are kind of connected to the stuff I like, because what I mentioned about the enemies reacting fairly realistically, it's more scripted than it seems at first. You see them do the same things over and over. They do that spin attack every time you hit them out of a stun. They pick up new weapons, which is cool, but sometimes they like They throw a weapon on the ground to pick up the same weapon elsewhere, and it's just like, what? By the end, you've seen them do the same thing so many times it takes away immersion, and that's not helped by when they just... While I'm whining, by the way, the hardest difficulty for some reason describes enemies as having just average accuracy, and it would be nicer if the combat was kind of more free-flowing. You can't fight with your fists and you can't throw objects, which can make it feel a little limited. It would be nice if it was more improvisational, like that game Paint the Town Red, but with this game's more weighty movement. But none of these problems are huge, they're just little things that I think could be improved. The combat overall is really good and there isn't much like it. I love games like Devil May Cry and Doom which have a really fast pace, but this more grounded and realistic brawler has its own qualities that I'd love to see tried more often. It's probably good that the combat stands out well because that's the game. There are these detective puzzle things, but they're not puzzles. These are more like lock-picking minigames that you can't fail. They're not great, but they don't take up much time, and I guess they change the pace a little, but They are actually used okay in this one house level near the end, which is completely different to the rest of the game. There's not much combat until the end, you're just tracing these lines through a spooky house as it builds atmosphere. I love houses in horror games, it's such a relatable environment. And this is the only level that isn't really linear. You have 4 paths to go down and you take them in whatever order you want. There's parts of other levels where you have to find an item to progress and you can find these secret areas, but they pretty much have one path to follow. In fact, this game's linear to the point where it closes doors behind you, so if you find a medkit and decide to save it for later, just use it because it will probably disappear. So yeah, the combat is really good, but it is most of what you do, which is weird because this is a horror game, and a lot of horror games have clunky combat and not much of it for the sake of horror, but this does the exact opposite. I guess we're talking about horror stuff now? Something I really like about this game is the environments. I mentioned the relatable level setting of a house, but this extends to most of the game. It's never like a mental hospital or a spooky mansion, it's got scarier locations like a school and low-income housing. You've probably been to places similar to the ones seen in the game. It helps you connect to it really nicely, but they're painted in this grim atmosphere making you know something's not right. I also like the way sound is used. There's more noticeable intense music for intense moments, which is always fun and hits a suitable industrial tone, but there's also a consistent soundscape throughout. I have no idea how this works, but the sound makes you feel really tense. It brings attention to the eerie quiet by making sound weirdly. You know that way where one person in an audience applauding is worse than no one applauding because it brings attention to the fact no one is applauding? There were moments where I just stared at empty space for a few seconds because I swore I'd heard something, but no one was there, I'm just stupid. This subdued and relatable creepy atmosphere is noticeable right down to the collectibles. You collect dead birds, which are always just kinda But despite all this, the game's just not scary. It's consistently creepy and tense, but never genuinely scary. Didn't stop Let's Plays of it though. I think the game's not scary because the horror stuff is just worn on its skin. The enemy design is scary and gradually gets scarier, but really it goes from homeless people to zombies to wrinkly people that you've seen in a million other horror things. I've seen them all before, and because of that, they're just not scary. And on top of that, you'll see them tons of times because of how consistent the combat is. Something becomes a lot less scary when you've seen it dealt with over and over again. Actually, there was this one design I liked because I'm a dum-dum who likes these kind of Clive Barker-y designs, but that's about it. Actually, I'm looking back on this while editing and I kinda like all the weird mannequin stuff. I think that's probably the most visually unique thing the game has, and that's probably why they used it for all the marketing and stuff, is because that's pretty much the visual identity of the game, is all the weird stuff it does with the mannequins and everything. I'm saying this all unscripted, by the way, if you couldn't tell. The combat actually takes away from the horror too, because it's too fun. It's quick, exciting, and you feel in control, which is the complete opposite of something like Silent Hill, where you defeat enemies through panicked swings. The checkpoints and linear design don't help either, with you just kind of being able to make consistent progress no matter what. I find that combat in horror is best when it has the same use as jump scares. It's not the actual event that's scary, it's the implication and what's built around it. I feel like I can't use the word implication now because of that It's Always Sunny scene. It's just a jump scare that comes out of nowhere as a quick burst of energy, just like a random quick combat encounter. But if you make people think there's gonna be a jump scare, then build the tension so they don't want to go forward before either actually having one or preferably not, it's much more effective. Similarly, if you give the player barely any ammo and no place to save, they'll creep forward with an anxious caution, which works much better than saying like, oh yeah, there's a guy around the corner, if you don't kill him then like, you can do it again. I often hear people say fear isn't scary because you're given guns, but that's not really the case I find. In fact, the more intense parts of this game were when I had a gun but no one was around, because if I messed up and ran out of ammo I was screwed. It's more the context the mechanics are used in and how they produce fear, and this game uses its mechanics in the context of a brawler with scary presentation. The scary presentation is really effective at being creepy, but it's never effective at scaring you, and the rest of the game doesn't support this. But don't let this go too far. There's a lot I don't like about this game, but I at least have things to criticise. This isn't like We Play Motion, where I think,
well, I don't know what's going on here, but I don't like it.
Everything I've criticised I actually like. The horror isn't scary, but it is effectively tense and creepy in a mostly subtle way. The combat is a bit glitchy and simplistic, but there isn't much like it that is this weighty and realistic, but still accessible. This game is really good and it's definitely worth playing. There's even tons of unlockable behind the scenes type extras, which I just absolutely love this stuff. There's space to improve, and there is a sequel. I might even talk about it one day because it is a bit weird, but as for this game, yeah, I like it a lot. It's not perfect, but there's nothing really like it, so play it. Shit, I forgot to mention the port stuff. Yeah, I had a couple problems getting this game to work. It's nothing awful, but I should probably mention it. There's little problems, like it doesn't recognise an Xbox One controller, which I've never had happen before, and it was pretty glitchy, but that was probably because the game ran at like 1000 FPS. After turning on VSync, that was fine. But there is the fact that this game has a fairly common problem where it starts lagging tons after playing for 15 minutes, and I swear the Steam version is just missing sound files, which ruins certain parts, like this train sequence where the train doesn't make a sound. Both of these problems are fixable, but still you do need to mess with it before it works properly. And this led me to find out I kind of prefer the Xbox version. The menus are just kind of uglier on PC, it feels stitched together, and the death screen is way creepier on Xbox. Also, this is probably just me, but I think the slower movement just feels a bit better with a controller, especially since the game doesn't ask for much accuracy. Both versions have their pros and cons.
Make your choice.
Anyway, Condemned, good. If you like what I said, play it. Don't wait for an easier to access sequel because it probably won't happen. I don't think Condemned 2 did very well, but like that's another thing. There was mention of a more indie team doing something with it, but that was back in 2015, and I think it was just one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, I'd do that, and then they don't, so I don't know. I'm rambling. Happy Halloween. Or, shit, it was Christmas, wasn't it?
I don't think I'll ever live to see a prophet. I don't want to be a locket, clinging to a chest till the last breath.